Thrown out of her own home, abandoned in the cold, she had no hope until a shocking discovery changed everything. The truth was hidden, but now it's time for justice. How did Eleanor turn the tables? Stay until the end to find out. What would you do in her place? Like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping stories. Eleanor Carter and Michael Carter had spent nearly 3 decades together, building a peaceful life in their charming old house in the suburbs of New York. Eleanor, 47, owned a small, vintage-style bookstore where she spent her days organizing old books and chatting with loyal customers. She loved her job, not for the money, but for the sense of tranquility it gave her. Michael, 50, was a talented architect. He had designed the very house they lived in, a home that reflected his personality, quiet, meticulous, and filled with warmth. Even though they never had children, their lives were rich with love, laughter, and long conversations over home-cooked dinners. But fate had a cruel twist in store for them. One day, Michael was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The disease struck suddenly without warning. When the doctor delivered the devastating news, Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She couldn't believe that the man who had always been so strong, so careful about planning their future, now had only 6 months to live. At first, Michael tried to stay optimistic. He kept working, assuring Eleanor that things would be fine. But she saw the truth: his body was failing him. His hands grew thinner, his skin paler, and the bright, determined eyes she loved now carried a deep exhaustion. He began skipping breakfast, his unfinished blueprints stacking up on his desk. Eleanor decided to cut back on her hours at the bookstore so she could care for him. She learned to cook healthier meals, stayed up late reading medical journals, and searched for every possible treatment that could buy him more time. But Michael only held her hand, giving her a tired smile. "You can't fight fate, Eleanor. I just want my last days to be peaceful." His words broke her heart. Though she tried to stay strong, she knew that every moment with him was slipping away. Some nights, she lay awake just watching him sleep, afraid that if she closed her eyes, he might not be there when she woke up. One evening, as the golden glow of the sunset filled the hospital room, Michael gently reached for her hand. His voice was weaker than before, but there was a firm resolve in his eyes. "Eleanor, I need you to promise me something." She squeezed his hand. "Anything. Protect our home. Don't let anyone take it from you." Eleanor frowned. "Why would you say that? This house is ours. Who could take it away?" Michael let out a small, knowing smile, but his expression remained serious. "I know my brother, David. He won't leave you alone. I've taken care of everything, but you have to promise me. Don't let them steal what belongs to you." Eleanor didn't fully understand why he was saying this. But seeing the worry in his eyes, she knew he was trying to protect her from something she couldn't yet see. So, she promised. A promise that, in time, she would realize was the beginning of a battle she never saw coming. The house was eerily silent. No more late-night conversations, no more footsteps echoing in the morning as Michael made coffee. Only an emptiness lingered, filling every corner, a void Eleanor never thought she would have to face. Michael Carter was gone. He had taken his last breath in the early hours of the morning, slipping away as gently as a passing breeze. No pain, no struggle, just Eleanor holding his now cold hand, silent tears streaming down her face as she watched the love of her life fade away. She was devastated, but at the same time, relieved that Michael was finally free from the cruel grip of cancer. She believed he had left peacefully, without any burdens left behind. She had no idea that Michael had never told her everything. Just a day after the funeral, Eleanor received an unexpected call from David Carter, Michael's older brother. His voice was calm yet oddly urgent. "Eleanor, there are some important documents regarding Michael that we need to discuss. Can we meet?" Exhausted and still grieving, she reluctantly agreed. She had no idea that this meeting would change everything. At the family lawyer's office, David, his wife Linda, and Michael's mother, Margaret Carter, were already waiting for her. Their expressions were serious, their demeanor oddly formal. As Eleanor took her seat, the family lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, carefully placed a thick folder on the table. "This is Michael's will," he announced. Eleanor's stomach twisted. A will? Michael had never mentioned drafting a will. He had never seemed concerned about inheritance or property matters. But now, an official document lay right in front of her. Her fingers trembled as she flipped it open and began to read. The words on the page made her blood run cold. All of Michael's assets, including the house, savings, and inheritance, were to be given to David Carter. Not her. Not a single thing left for her. Eleanor's breath hitched. "No, this can't be right," she whispered, her eyes darting back and forth over the page. David leaned forward slightly, his voice smooth. "He just wanted to keep everything in the family, Eleanor. You understand, don't you?" Margaret placed a gentle yet firm hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Michael knew you don't have children, dear. The family still needs a home. He was just doing what was right." Eleanor felt like the floor had disappeared beneath her. Michael had never said a word about this. Never. But the signature on the document was his. The handwriting was his. The legal certifications were valid. There was nothing she could challenge. A heavy wave of nausea washed over her. What Eleanor didn't know was that Michael had been forced to sign it. No one told her that David and Margaret had waited until Michael was at his weakest, taken his frail hand, pressed the pen into his fingers, and guided him to write exactly what they wanted. They hadn't forged the will. They had turned Michael into a tool to write down exactly what they needed. And Michael, in unbearable pain, in the final moments of his life, had been powerless to stop them. Eleanor looked up at the faces staring back at her: David, Linda, Margaret, all of them waiting for her response. She felt like she was drowning. She had lost Michael. And now, it seemed like she was about to lose their home too. The cold night rain poured down relentlessly, soaking through Eleanor's thin clothes, clinging to her shivering frame. She walked aimlessly down the empty streets, where dim streetlights reflected in puddles, each step feeling heavier as if she were sinking into despair. She had nothing left. She had lost Michael. She had lost their home. And now, she didn't even have a place to stay. The old suitcase in her trembling hands held only a few pieces of clothing and a single photograph of Michael, the one where he was smiling brightly during a beach trip they had taken years ago. Her fingers clenched around it as if it were the last thread keeping her from falling into the abyss of grief. But the cruel truth was that she had lost everything. Just this morning, she had still stood inside the home that she and Michael built together. But now it belonged to those who never deserved it. "You should leave now, Eleanor," David had said coldly, his face void of sympathy. "This house belongs to my family now. Don't make things harder than they need to be." Linda stood beside him, arms crossed, smirking. "We've already been generous enough, giving you extra time. Now it's time for you to go." Margaret Carter, their mother, simply sat silently in Michael's chair, her old but calculating eyes staring at Eleanor. At one point, Eleanor had thought that after losing Michael, his family would at least show her a shred of kindness. But no, they never saw her as family. They had taken everything from her without hesitation, without remorse. Eleanor stood there, trembling, as she watched them celebrate their victory. "Stop just standing there. It's about to rain," Linda sneered. "Better find yourself a bench somewhere." Eleanor didn't answer. She had no energy left to argue. She just quietly dragged her suitcase behind her, letting silent tears roll down her face. When the rain finally hit, it brought with it a bone-chilling cold, one that mirrored the emptiness inside her. Eleanor didn't know how long or how far she had walked. She just kept moving, even as her feet throbbed with pain, even as the icy wind cut through her soaked clothes like a blade. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten all day. She had nowhere to go. Before, whenever she was tired, she always had a place to return to, a home where Michael would greet her with a warm hug. "Tough day? Come inside, I'll make you some tea." The memory hit her like a knife to the heart. But now, there was no one waiting for her anymore. No home. No Michael. She looked around. Only darkness, Wet streets, and strangers passing by without a second glance at the woman who had lost everything. It was so cold. She tried to find shelter under a storefront, but everything was closed. No one wanted to take in a homeless woman. Eleanor collapsed onto a stone step, pressing her back against a freezing brick wall, clutching her suitcase as if it were all she had left. The photograph of Michael slipped from her bag, falling into the wet pavement. Frantically, she picked it up, pressing it against her chest, her hands trembling. "Michael, you promised to protect me. But why? Why did I end up like this?" Her tears fell, mixing with the rain. Meanwhile, back at the home that should have been hers, her in-laws were celebrating their triumph. "Finally, we got rid of that useless woman. Now we can start our new life." Laughter echoed through the house that Michael had built with love, the house that was supposed to be hers. Eleanor curled into herself, shivering under the merciless downpour, lost in a city that no longer felt like home. She had lost her husband. She had lost her family. She had lost herself. The freezing night rain continued to drench Eleanor, soaking through her thin clothes as she curled up in the corner of an old building, trying to shield herself from the bone-chilling wind. Hunger, exhaustion, and the cold weighed down on her, making every breath feel like a struggle. She had thought this was the absolute rock bottom of her despair. Then, suddenly, the phone in her soaked pocket rang. Startled, Eleanor fumbled to pull out the old device, its dim screen barely glowing through the rain. She hadn't expected anyone to call. When she saw the name flashing on the screen, Nancy, hospital nurse, her heart clenched. A faint glimmer of hope flickered in her chest. She quickly answered, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Nancy, is something wrong?" On the other end, Nancy's voice was urgent, yet filled with excitement. "Eleanor, you won't believe this. I was cleaning out Michael's hospital room and found something hidden under his pillow. It's a will." Eleanor's breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around the phone. "A will? Are you sure?" "I checked it. It's official, with his signature and fingerprints. I think he hid it there because he was afraid someone might take it." Eleanor's hands began to tremble. Michael hadn't betrayed her. Even in his final days, he had been thinking of her, protecting her in the only way he could. "Nancy, please, take a picture and send it to me." Eleanor's voice was almost a desperate plea. A few seconds later, a photo popped up on her screen. Heart pounding, she opened it and saw the first few lines of text. "I, Michael Carter, leave all my assets, including my house and savings, to my wife, Eleanor Carter." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Everything was hers. Her home, her savings, everything that her in-laws had stolen, it had always belonged to her. Tears streamed down her face, but this time, they weren't from despair. She had found hope. Nancy's voice broke through her thoughts. "Eleanor, you need to come to the hospital immediately. We can also check the security footage to see what really happened." Eleanor nodded, even though Nancy couldn't see her. "I'll be there right away." The next morning, despite her exhaustion from a sleepless night, Eleanor arrived at the hospital early. Nancy was waiting for her at the reception desk, holding a file with the original will. Eleanor ran her fingers over the paper, tracing Michael's familiar handwriting. He had never betrayed her. But that also meant her in-laws had deceived everyone. Nancy led her to the security office, where a hospital staff member helped them pull up the surveillance footage from Michael's final days. And then, the horrifying truth played out before Eleanor's eyes. On the screen, she watched as David Carter and Margaret Carter stood beside Michael's hospital bed, gripping his frail hand, forcing him to sign the fraudulent will. Michael had been too weak to resist. His lips moved as if trying to protest, but his fragile hands were trapped under David's firm grip, guiding the pen to sign the papers they had prepared. A surge of rage ignited within Eleanor. They had exploited Michael's final moments to steal everything from her. Her fists clenched tightly. She wouldn't let them get away with this. She would take back what was rightfully hers. Eleanor Carter stepped into the law office, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. Sitting across from her was Jonathan Pierce, the skilled attorney Nancy had connected her with after discovering Michael's real will. Jonathan carefully flipped through the documents, his sharp eyes scanning each detail. After a few moments of silence, he looked up and spoke with certainty. "Eleanor, you now have the strongest evidence in your hands. This is the legitimate will, signed and fingerprinted by Michael. Your in-laws have deceived everyone." His words ignited a fire inside Eleanor. She finally had the chance to reclaim what was rightfully hers. Jonathan quickly devised a plan. The first step, confront David Carter and his family directly. The next day, Eleanor and Jonathan went straight to the house that had been stolen from her. Her in-laws were gathered in the living room, enjoying the luxurious lifestyle they thought they had secured forever. When Eleanor stepped inside, all laughter ceased. "Eleanor? What are you doing here?" Linda sneered, her voice dripping with disdain. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She locked eyes with David and then placed the real will on the table. "This is Michael's legitimate will. This house and all of his assets never belong to you." David let out a chuckle, but the flicker of concern in his eyes didn't go unnoticed. "You're delusional. Michael left everything to his family. We have his signed will to prove it." Jonathan calmly pulled out another stack of documents from his briefcase. "I'm afraid the will you're referring to is nothing more than a forgery. We've had it examined, and it is completely invalid." The room tensed. "Lies. Michael signed it himself." Margaret Carter shrieked, her face turning pale. Eleanor's gaze turned icy. "Are you sure about that?" "Because the hospital has security cameras, and we reviewed the footage." David and Linda stiffened. Jonathan retrieved a USB drive and plugged it into the large TV in the living room. The hospital surveillance footage began playing. On the screen, a frail, exhausted Michael lay in his hospital bed, barely able to lift his own hand. Surrounding him were David, Linda, and Margaret. "Just sign here, and it's done." David's voice played through the speakers. Michael weakly shook his head, but David grabbed his trembling hand, forcing him to hold the pen. "If you don't do this, Eleanor gets nothing. We'll take care of everything," Linda whispered menacingly. On the screen, Michael squeezed his eyes shut in defeat. Then, with his limp hand being guided by them, he signed the paper. The video ended. A suffocating silence filled the room. Margaret froze in place, Linda turned ghostly pale, and David stood rigid, his jaw clenched in fury. Jonathan spoke smoothly but firmly. "This footage is irrefutable evidence that you coerced Michael into signing a fraudulent document. Under the law, this constitutes fraud and could lead to criminal prosecution." Eleanor crossed her arms, her voice cold but unwavering. "Did you really think I would just let this go? No. I will take back everything. And this time, justice will be on my side." After the evidence was revealed, Eleanor Carter was no longer the weak woman oppressed by her in-laws. She was ready to reclaim everything. With the support of attorney Jonathan Pierce, Eleanor officially sued David Carter, Linda, and Margaret for fraud and coercing a dying man into signing an unlawful will. The court swiftly took on the case, and soon after, the verdict was announced. David's family not only lost ownership of the house, but they were also ordered to compensate Eleanor $30,000 for the emotional and legal damages they had caused her. With no home and no wealth to cling to, David, Linda, and Margaret fell into hardship, forced to move into a small, run-down apartment, struggling every day. The luxury they once stole from Michael was now nothing but a distant memory. No longer a respected businessman, David Carter drowned in debt. The loans he once used to fund his lavish lifestyle were due, and with no assets left to pay them off, creditors began chasing him down, threatening him. He was no longer the confident, arrogant man he once was. Now, he was just a broken, penniless failure. Linda soon spiraled into crisis as well. She, who had once lived a life of indulgence, now faced a harsh reality. Once dressed in designer clothes and sipping wine in a grand living room, she now had to take on menial jobs just to survive. Her resentment toward David grew stronger, and their fights became more vicious by the day. Margaret, who once sat in Michael's favorite armchair with smug satisfaction, was now crammed into a tiny apartment, spending her last days in bitter regret. She had once commanded people, but now, no one listened to her anymore. The neighbors she once looked down on now pitied or even despised her. Desperation consumed them. No money, no reputation, no help. They had laughed when they threw Eleanor out into the rain, but now they were the ones left stranded, with nowhere to turn. One night, in a drunken rage, David screamed that it was all Eleanor's fault. But in truth, this was the price they had to pay for their endless greed. Eleanor's new beginning. She walked back into her home with her head held high, where peace and rightful ownership were finally restored. Each morning, she stood before Michael's portrait, speaking softly to him as if he were still there. "The weather is beautiful today, Michael. I bought some of your favorite plants for the porch." Those whispered words kept her and Michael forever connected. Justice was served. And finally, Eleanor Carter reclaimed her life.